And joining us now on the debate from the nation's capital, Don Hutchinson. He is Director of Law and Public Policy at the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. And here in studio, Father Raymond D'Souza, Chaplain at Newman House at Queen's University in Kingston. The Reverend Lee Simpson, Director of Operations at the United Church Observer. Dr. Robert Buckman, former President of the Humanist Association of Canada. Roberto Martella, community activist and the proprietor of Grano Restaurant, one of the great spots in this neighborhood, I'll say. And Raheel Raza, intercultural and interfaith diversity consultant and the author of Their Jihad, Not My Jihad. I welcome all of you around this table and, of course, to Don in the nation's capital. We are going to talk this evening about the advisability of dropping the Lord's Prayer, which is what they have done for a very long time in the Ontario legislature to start each sitting day. And before we do, let's hear from the Premier and get some explanation of why he's considering this. Roll tape, please, Michael.
We continue to change as a province, as a society, in terms of our makeup and our cultures and our faiths. And I think we've got a responsibility to ensure that all people feel truly at home here. And we're going to come up with a solution which will be a great solution for Ontario.
Okay, let's go around the horn. I want brief comments from everybody just so our viewers can understand where you're all coming from. Rob Buckman, what do you think?
The principle of separating church and state is a very, very good one. In terms of the effect that the Lord's Prayer has, I'm not sure it actually made any difference. Like in marriages where you say, let no man split them asunder because God's put them together, and they do in 50% of cases. So I'm not really worried about the effect, but the principle.
Lee Simpson.
I speak tonight on behalf of the United Church Observer and not the United Church of Canada, largely because I think, unlike many of the folks that shelter within the United Church, that there is no argument to be made for leaving the Lord's Prayer, the only prayer of any faith, spoken in our legislative halls.
Father Raymond D'Souza.
Well, I'm in favor of leaving it there, but I think before we even get to that point, I would say that the Premier's made a mistake in stirring up trouble where there was no trouble before. And this will not, however it's resolved, it's going to leave people upset that otherwise beforehand were, I think, quite content.
Roberto Martella.
Well, I think the Premier has actually done the province a great service by attempting to create a new Ontario. The very word Ontarians doesn't trip off my tongue, my lips so easily, and I dare say I'm not alone in this province. So I agree with Rob, clear demarcation between church and state. As a citizen, as a humanist though, I don't think we necessarily have to cut off the body from the soul, the head from the soul.
We'll get into all these distinctions as the night goes on. Raheel Raza.
I think it's very unadvisable to let go of the Lord's Prayer. As a woman of faith and as someone who has studied in a Catholic school and college all my life, I really like the Lord's Prayer.
What religion are you?
I'm a Muslim.
And you want to keep the Lord's Prayer?
I am a Mary Muslim, by the way. And yes, I would like to leave the Lord's Prayer because to me, the idea of beginning something or anything in the name of the Lord is a very sacred idea, and it's a wonderful idea, and I don't think that every other diversity can be accommodated there. Otherwise, all they'll do in legislature is pray, which is perhaps better than what they do now. But I certainly think that they should leave the Lord's Prayer alone. There's absolutely no reason to take it out because it gives an idea that there's something wrong with it. And what could be wrong with the Lord's Prayer?
Don Hutchinson, let's hear from you.
Well, Steve, I don't think that we can pretend for a moment that legislating is something that can be done simply using the human mind. I think there's an awareness that we can all use a little bit of extra guidance. The Lord's Prayer originally was a sectarian solution to allow Catholics and Protestants to be engaged in the legislative assembly of the province of Ontario. And it's not such a bad thing to consider a form of prayer that recognizes our current composition, which, by the way, Ontario still remains over 70% self-identifying as Christians.
Well, as a matter of fact, we have these numbers here, and let's bring them up. Now, admittedly, this is 2001 census numbers, so they're a little bit different from where we are today or where we'll be when the next census is taken. But, Michael, let's bring these up, and these are still pretty accurate 7 years later. Yes, 75% of Ontarians self-identify as Christians. Muslim 3%, Jewish 2%, Buddhist 1%, Hindu 2%, Sikh 1%, and there's Rob Buckman at the bottom, 16%. No religion, 16%, yeah. No religion whatsoever, which is, I guess, the second largest cohort in the province of Ontario.
Which is not insignificant.
Not at all. Does it offend you that the Lord's Prayer is said at the legislature to start each sitting?
It wouldn't offend me either way, but I just wish we'd be a little bit consistent. It would be fabulous if politicians got up in the mouth and said, "You have trespassed against me. You know what? I'm going to forgive you." Because it said in the Lord's Prayer that we said this morning that we should forgive each other, and that's what I'm going to do. The point is that it really doesn't matter. I mean, they mutter all kinds of things to start things off, but they don't actually pay attention. And in fact, acknowledging the clear separation of faith, which is not the human mind, and state is a very, very important thing. The human mind, sorry to argue with Don, the human mind is the only mind we've got. And everybody else differs about any supernatural influences.
But Roberto, let me follow up on these numbers, because while the numbers do show Ontario is still overwhelmingly a Christian place, they will in years to come show something different. There will be more of other groups to come. And I want to know why you think it's worthwhile throwing out a prayer that still speaks to the vast majority of people in this province and reflects our tradition as well.
Well, I think traditions are made to be broken, and I think, well, it's very, very important. The Lord's Prayer is very, very important, because it's interesting that the Premier, who is a good Catholic, would have raised this issue as a humanist, as a politician. And I think it's very, very important that he did so, because Christian is what Christian does. So it's one thing to glibly say we have 75% Christian population in Ontario, the same way we have Catholic schools that are funded by the province, but most of the children who attend those Catholic schools don't go to church on Sunday, which is a major precept of the Catholic Church. So I think there's a bit of an hypocrisy there. And I think rather from a humanist point of view, that we provide something that everyone can be accommodated with. Though I don't like that word, because accommodate isn't really Ontarian. It's a little too kind of tolerant. And I think we have to be much more proactive in creating something very, very new, fresh.
Father Raymond, are you making the argument that the prayer should be kept because it is a tradition? Do you want to say that?
Well, I would disagree with Roberto. I don't think traditions are made to be broken, because, I mean, they adapt, but if they're always broken, you don't get a tradition.
Then how's that?
And as to Rob's point, I mean, if the standard is sincerity, sincerity for speech in the legislature, we wouldn't have almost anything.
That is the point.
Right? The prayer might be the thing we'll have to stop. Not only because it's a tradition. I mean, it is a tradition, and traditions are important. It does give expression to the religious faith of the majority of Ontarians. It's in a pretty innocuous way, as Robert was
apart from the 16%, yeah.
Aside from the 16%, people don't find it offensive. Very few people, a normal, well-adjusted, broad-minded Ontarian isn't offended to hear a prayer of someone else's faith. I do think there is a particular problem with changing the prayer, is that the legislature reflects all kinds of traditions. Most of those traditions are going to stay unquestioned. When you say only the religious traditions have to be updated, modified, thrown out, but the civil traditions, the racial traditions, the ethnic traditions that are reflected in the architecture and the symbolism. In the federal parliament, for example, all of the decorations to celebrate the 4 founding races, which are not the majority races in Canada today. So when you say only the religious tradition has to be modified, ejected, then I think you are sort of pushing an agenda that's not just about diversity.
Raheel, I'm very interested in your position on this, because I don't have to tell you that many Muslims over the course of history have been, killed or forcibly converted or a whole bunch of other things in the name of this prayer. Why does it not offend you?
Because there is nothing offensive about it. I mean, this whole idea, we're talking about the Lord, is my Lord and your Lord the same Lord? It doesn't matter. The question is that it is the intention behind wanting to change this. And as Father D'Souza said, the idea that we now have more than 40 faiths reflected on the Ontario Multi-Faith Council. There is no way on the face of this earth, practically, that everyone can be included in this.
So everyone should just embrace this one?
Well, they don't necessarily have to embrace it. They don't even necessarily have to practice it. We are not asking for the prayer to be imposed on everyone and for everyone to stand up and say, I'm also going to follow this or say it. They just have to respect it as a tradition that already exists.
But it is imposed. That's the thing. It is imposed by its very nature. And we use the word innocuous. Well, I don't think it's quite innocuous, because the very fact that it's imposed, and And people who haven't come forward previously to complain about it, I dare say it's because they haven't felt comfortable, because they're in the majority. The 75% is they're in the minority rather, 75% rules and dictates. So people say, okay, it's not a big deal, let's just leave it. But I think we need to be much more active in creating this new Ontario.
Well, I'd be very interested in seeing, you know, how all this is going to be knit together and created, and then in how many other places they're going to be taking out some of the symbols and the ideas of the mainstream majority. And we have to understand that those people, the minority faiths and the minorities that have come to Canada, have come here very well knowing that this was a Judeo-Christian society.
But I don't
And I think
Lee
we
and then
really, Steve,
All right, go ahead, Don, and then we'll get to Lee.
we need to recognize something too. There's a foundational principle that is different from that which has been stated. In Canada, we have no such doctrine of separation of church and state. In fact, in Canada, we have a long history of non-sectarianism, and that is that we found ways to accommodate relationships between the church and the state. There's no official state church, but neither is there any official separation. And I agree with what Father De Souza has said in regard to the traditions of the legislature, that the legislature is a place where the traditions of the province of Ontario come together, where we find expression of not only the founding peoples, but the continuing peoples coming into the province of Ontario. And it's a place in the public square that should be inclusive, an opportunity for expression, both religious and non-religious, to coexist, so that we can really be the inclusive, diverse society that the Premier talks about.
Reverend Lee.
I am not sure that that coexistence can be the way that the legislator intended if we continue to honor the tradition of this particular prayer. The Lord's Prayer has an interesting theological origin. It was intended to teach us how to pray, and more specifically, how not to pray hypocritically, how not to pray with hypocrisy, how to pray honestly and genuinely. And I'm not sure that enforcing people to pray this specific formula is in the spirit either of the canon theologically or the larger question of the division of church and state.
Rob Buckman.
Important thing, religion is only one aspect of what human beings do. And I think it's very important that we are able to separate our activities. Very important that we separate our supernatural beliefs from our actual parliamentarian duties, as it were. And in some respects, we might all believe that flossing your teeth or having your bowels open every day is a very good thing. But you don't actually get to say, before we start the Parliament session, well, we want to say how much we appreciate flossing the teeth. It's irrelevant.
That's not a great analogy, though, is it? That's not really a great analogy.
I think that the Lord's Prayer is something that people might actually want to do themselves, and it is no business in the House of Parliament.
Well, you know what? Let's put this in context, because we do. Our producer Erica Bulch put a nice list together here, and Michael, let's bring this up right now, which shows what many other legislatures in this country are doing. We'll go through them here. New Brunswick does recite the Lord's Prayer, but precedes it with a prayer that blesses the legislature. Prince Edward Island says the Lord's Prayer behind closed doors before the chamber is open to the public. Newfoundland and Labrador, no prayer in the House of Assembly at all. You should run for Premier there, Rob. You'd like that. Quebec, no prayers, but a moment of daily reflection. And as we all know, they're keeping the crucifix. Alberta, non-denominational prayers are rotated through. In British Columbia, they also rotate the prayers, but they allow individual members to select the daily reading. In Manitoba, they have reworded portions of the prayer and are still using the prayer drafted in 1931, so a lot of tradition there. In Nova Scotia, the Speaker wrote a prayer in 1972, and they still use that one today. And how about in the North? Nunavut, they rotate prayers. Northwest Territories, they use a non-denominational prayer. The Yukon, the current Speaker rotates 3 non-denominational prayers. So obviously, most other legislatures in this country have considered this, dealt with this, and for whatever reason have opted not to continue to use the Lord's Prayer. What do you make of it?
Actually, Steve, I think that
Go ahead, Don.
I think that what that information shows is that other legislatures are respecting either the use of the Lord's Prayer representative of the Christian population in their province, or they're using other forms of prayer that are expressions of the faith groups of the members of the legislature or within the province. And there's a tacit recognition in that faith has a place in the public square.
Admittedly, there is a tacit recognition of that, but not that the faith needs to be Christian.
Let me follow up on something that challenged something that Don said. Don suggested that was non-sectarian. I should think we want to be positive and be multi-sectarian. And we have our head of state is the head of the C of E, the Church of England. So whether we're aware of it or not, we're really affected by that. The good Reverend taught at the Canadian College School in Italy, in Lanciano, Abruzzo, and taught world religions. There's no reason, if we really want to be as multicultural, as diverse as we trade on, that we shouldn't be much more open-minded. Not that we want to favor one religion over another, nor that we want to be too accommodating.
But Roberto, would you agree there's a place for faith in our public square, in our public life, if you like?
Absolutely.
I wouldn't.
Oh, and I wouldn't disagree in any way, obviously. But that place is not in an enforced political situation. We have to lay a foundation for the future where our province is without doubt going to become less Christian and more diverse.
You keep saying enforced. But
Yes.
there's no one who's obliged to be in the chamber to hear that prayer when the day starts.
I don't disagree with you, but in an atmosphere where prayer is the norm, to absent oneself, it makes an uncomfortable time, and there is no way that that should be the top note of our Legislative Assembly.
Let me ask a question then. Is it not possible, I mean, instead of making such a hoopla about something I think which is really very, very, very minor, that those people who don't want to participate in the Lord's Prayer just keep quiet? I mean, those who want to can pray. I mean, it's done aloud in a congregation, and this happens many times. As a person of a minority religious faith, there are sometimes opportunities when I'm in a group and I don't necessarily know the prayer that the majority is reciting, so I just stand in respect and I don't say anything.
Rob, how about
So some provinces, as Steve told us, don't say anything at all. And I didn't know that Quebec had 1 minute of self-reflection. I would love that. And if you want to
Yeah, but
rotate
there's a
it,
big
that's fine.
crucifix up there while they're doing it.
Sure. The decoration is not all that relevant. I mean, the decoration is not necessarily a sign of internal belief. Thinking about what you actually believe in and making that a sort of 1 minute, I think we should, 16% of the time, us atheists, it should be allowed to have 1 minute. And then, of course, everyone would like atheism because they have 1 minute when they don't have to concentrate on what somebody else is saying.
But then they just have to listen to their conscience, and that could be even more devastating.
I'm quite good at that now, yeah.
Perhaps they'll be able to think about the meaning of the Lord's Prayer if they're silent and listening about it.
Go ahead,
Is
Don.
that a problem?
No.
It's kind of objectionable to hear comments that talk about the need or an expression that privatizes faith. The Supreme Court of Canada has been very clear on this issue. Certainly in the Chamberlain and Surrey School District case, they had a plurality in the decision, most clearly stated by Mr. Justice Gonche, that the religiously informed mind has a place in the public square, that the religiously informed mind should not be silenced in the public square. And while I agree wholeheartedly that a form of prayer should not be forced upon people, when it's optional for those who wish to participate at the beginning of the day, there should be ways of allowing for expressions of prayer reflecting the religious traditions of either those in the legislature or the majority of the people in the province, or let's share prayers
Or all the people in
that
the
are
province,
taking
not
place.
just the majority.
Okay. Rob
Don,
Buckman,
that's what I said. We share
You're
prayers.
blurring the margin, a very important margin. Public square, absolutely. The public square is not Parliament. Parliament is where we do our laws bit.
Oh,
And in some respect,
Rob, the
where we do our
legislature.
laws bit is quite different from where we can talk about things. And in many respects, what really matters is separating, actually making the laws and sorting that stuff out, rendering unto Caesar, as the language would go, from any supernatural belief which is not necessarily shared by all the people in that room.
Okay, Don,
Rob,
come on back.
Rob, the legislature is the pinnacle of the public square. If we can't express faith in the legislature, then we begin to retract through various forms, in various ways, from various places within the public
not at
square,
all.
and faith becomes privatized.
No, that's not at all. Most religions actually would actually accept that faith really is a matter of private belief. And in Canada, we all accept that everybody is entitled to their own belief about the presence or absence of a supernatural force. And I think we would all say that the problem is, as it were, blurring the margin between faith and state. That's the problem.
Rob, I don't think you can speak on behalf of most religions or all people when clearly there are people on the panel who are speaking from their religious perspective and disagree with you.
I love the way you keep on referring to religion as a supernatural force.
I do.
Having said this, there is another point that comes to me. And that is that, you know, when we're teaching our children about faith, whatever faith that is, the idea is that, you know, when you respect your own faith, other people respect it too. So, you know, we come to Canada as you know, immigrants or new Canadians, and we want to see the respect that the majority Canadians have for their own faith traditions. And when this happens, it seems that it's somehow being diluted, and it all ties in with the idea that you can't have a Christmas tree, you can't say Merry Christmas, and as I said, this dilution creates a lot of confusion. That, you know, okay, this is the mainstream majority. They're having difficulty even adjusting to their own faith traditions that have been there. So, hello, today they're finding that there's got to be separation of church and state, and we're discussing this in 2008. It's already been there for a while.
Let me put this to Roberto, let me put this to you first. Is it not the case that if you start every day with a prayer, okay, the Lord's Prayer is what they've been doing in this province for X number of years, does it not remind the people who are in that legislature that there's something bigger going on than just them and their careers and their egos and their internecine warfare? And is that not a good thing to do?
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Steve, now. And I would like to recommend that at the beginning of the agenda every day, the most watched program in Ontario, and certainly the most intelligent, that you say good evening in a language that represents the different languages of Ontario. So the same thing in the legislature, that perhaps an evocation needn't be spiritual, could be a poem that reflects one of the many great groups in Ontario, could be a prayer, could be a reading, could be someone inviting the members of the legislature to maintain a moment of silence. Something, I believe, sure, an evocation is something good to mark the occasion, very significant occasion. But once you start to introduce a prayer, an official prayer, the Lord's Prayer, then I'm also concerned about the people, the young people that you refer to who come here. Are they not feeling somewhat marginalized? Because notwithstanding the fact that you're an adult, intelligent woman, and you can keep quiet when the majority is making the Lord's Prayer, there are younger people who feel like second-class citizens.
Well,
let me get Raymond D'Souza on this. No one feels like a second-class citizen to hear someone else pray. If I was in an Islamic country, or I was in a Jewish country in Israel, and they pray Hebrew prayers or Islamic prayers, you don't feel like a second-class citizen. A normal, broad-minded person can listen to other prayers. Especially, I'm touched by the concern in this panel for the fragility of our elected members. They can handle listening to other prayers. We have in the federal parliament a whole group that doesn't believe in the national anthem, and they can get on fair enough listening to the national anthem. The point is not so much, as Roberto says, when you introduce the Lord's Prayer, the point is it's there. It's there, it's been there for a long time. It reflects a certain aspect of Ontario's history, an important aspect, its religious background. So it's not a question of starting from scratch and saying, what would we do in some sort of ideal, abstract world? What do we do in Ontario today? Do we reject, remove this prayer? Your interesting tagline in the beginning was McGuinty's quagmire, because everybody knows that this is going to degenerate into some kind of impossible effort to please everybody. You're going to get a lowest common denominator. Prayer might be in inverted commas to listen to it.
Which will say nothing
Which
at the
will
end
say
of the day?
nothing. So we've got something here. It doesn't mean that what other provinces have is better or worse. But this is what we have in Ontario. It reflects the reality of Ontario today. It will reflect the reality of Ontario for quite some time. And it doesn't actually cause offense. Who, before the Premier brought this up, was agitating for the Lord's Prayer to be removed from the legislature?
Well, in fact, there are tens of thousands of signatures that have come to the legislature asking that it be kept.
Yes, so
anyway, go ahead, Rob, you wanted to
very
say.
important. I mean, your idea, Steve, was an important theoretical idea that if prayer, we think about something bigger, less on the internecine warfare. It's exactly the opposite what prayer has done in the last 5 millennia. Usually, internecine warfare, not always, but often internecine warfare, it started by differences in prayer, even differences in interpretation of the same God. And I don't want to argue, but if I happened to be in Germany in the Third Reich, and I said, you know, oh, it's Judeo-Christian, it's all the same God, everything's happening fine. Believe me, the Nazis would not have believed that. They wouldn't have taken it. I was just lucky I was born afterwards.
We're carrying this a bit too far, but I like your idea of saying that, you know, instead of removing the Lord's Prayer, you can keep it and build on it. See, this was my point when I said that when there is something that already exists as a tradition, to remove it gives the message that there's something wrong with it. And it bothers me you know, as a woman of faith, any faith, it bothers me that you would remove something. You can add on to it.
Well,
you
let me
can,
go on
you
a
know,
bit of a
change.
tangent here with Roberto, and that is,
My specialty.
this is your specialty, indeed. Well, some of us are old enough to remember the 1960s in this country, the big flag debate. They got rid of the red ensign. We now have the flag, which is, I think most Canadians would agree, is a fantastic flag. But when they got rid of the red ensign, the Premier of the day, John Robarts, decided to take that flag and create an Ontario flag. He took off the national coat of arms, and there you see it. And he put on the Ontario coat of arms, along with the Union Jack in the top left corner. Ontario didn't have a flag before that. That's our official flag. Roberto, do you have a problem with that flag?
I don't have a problem, but I think it shouldn't be there. We should have our own flag. I'm wearing this evening a necktie, the Fleur de Lis, or the Giglio in Italian. It's the Italians, the patron saint of Florence is San Giovanni Battista, Saint Jean Baptiste, 24th of June. And I think we have a wonderful flower which could easily become our flag. I think the very notion that Robarts, and I read about it in your book, the wonderful book you did about John Robarts, I thought it was retrogressive. Here we have Pearson and company creating this wonderful new flag, and John Robarts, who, with the possible exception of this blunder, I call it, was a great premier, great man, decided, no, I'm going to keep the red ensign. So
you know why he did it?
It was retrogressive. He was afraid
The
of losing
explanation
it.
he gave was damn good politics.
Yeah, well, there you go.
It was a different
and
Ontario
I think now McGuinty is practicing damn good politics by raising this issue, and furthermore, damn good politics by underscoring our need. I agree, we need traditions, we need symbols, but symbols that the whole population of Ontario can embrace.
Okay, well, Lee, if you want to get rid of the Lord's Prayer, you want to get rid of the flag too?
I am not sure I have an opinion on the flag, not being a flag bearer, but I am a bearer of the Lord's Prayer. But when it is used, I wish it to be taken seriously. And I think that there is an opening here for damn good politics and very healthy religion. If we bring in this reflective moment, there may be people who are currently mouthing the prayer without really thinking about it because they've done so for 30 years, to actually stop and think and have a genuine prayer of the heart. I think that's more important.
Rob, are there any other conventions or traditions you would like to see us get rid of?
Well, have you got a moment? Religion, I mean, the word means binding together. I mean, it actually, so religions have always got something to do with community. That's not the problem. That's great and terrific. And traditions have always done that by religio, by binding people together. The problem is that when there's a supernatural God, unfortunately, people take it literally. And that wouldn't matter, except they then go and kill each other as a result of what they say their particular supernatural God told them to do. And that's the problem.
You're going to forgive me. I want to do one more follow-up on the flag. Raheel, are you born in Canada?
No. No, I've been here 20 years. I feel like I was born here.
When you look at that Ontario flag,
Yes.
do you think that flag represents you?
Oh, yes.
You do?
Of course.
You're obviously not of proper British stock, right? And yet the Union Jack is on that flag. And do you feel it does not represent you?
I have no problem with it. This is the whole issue. It's not a question of, you know, one can always find fault with everything around us. And, you know, as Roberto says, I mean, my God, there are more than 100 languages spoken in Ontario. Soon we are going to have your program in 100 languages. So, you know, why is it just that there's English and French? These are things that we eventually get used to. I have no problem with the flag. I mean, you know, why do I want to start thinking of negative things? You know, what other problems do I have with the Lord's Prayer, with the flag, with the Judeo-Christian majority? Because as I said to you, it's not a surprise that this is the Judeo-Christian majority. This is what we are aware of when we come here. It's not that we are coming to the Holy Land by any chance. We're coming to Canada, which, if I last remember, was a secular democracy, where there is freedom of religion, where I practice my religion more freely than I would in my land of birth. And if that makes an impact, then certainly I respect the Lord's Prayer in the legislature.
Okay.
Just one thing, while you were talking, I just thought, something that just occurred to me I'd never thought of before. When I looked at I was born in England, when I looked at the Union Jack, I never sort of thought that represents me. But it's really, in the last 20 years, I immigrated to Canada also, I must say that when I see the maple leaf, I actually do. I do get a fluttery. And I'm saying, it may not be, I don't know whether it's patriotism or not, but it's certainly a feeling. I'm really proud of that. I'm proud of what, absolutely.
Are humanists allowed to have a flutter?
Best offer I've had all day. Thank you very much indeed. That's nice.
Okay, let us move into the home stretch here. And I want to get a little cheeky with this next question. So, Don, I'm going to bring you in for this one. Is it a bit strange that on the one hand, the government is trying to get rid of the Lord's Prayer for all of the reasons that we've discussed tonight, not inclusive enough and so on and so forth. But then on the other hand, this government, as many governments do, panders like crazy to so many different ethnic groups and celebrates so many festivals, and they put up a giant-size menorah on the south lawn of Queen's Park at Hanukkah, and, you know, on the one hand trying to de-emphasize that sort of formal link between church and state and Christianity, but on the other hand, oh my goodness, do you think there's some hypocrisy going on here?
Well, Steve, I find it interesting that the efforts to de-link, as you said, are usually to delink from relationship with Christianity, but not other faith expressions. As a multicultural nation, we have many cultures which have also brought faith traditions, and Christianity is not the least of them for many of the cultures. As to whether the Premier wants to get rid of the Lord's Prayer, I think the Premier has asked for the special committee of the legislature to examine the issue rather than to do away with the Lord's Prayer. And a part of that examination is discussions such as that which we're having this evening, the submissions which are being made to the legislative committee that's examining the issue, and a consideration as to where we've come from, what our tradition is, how it bodes for the future, and perhaps, as Raheel says, taking what has been successful and positive and encouraging and has brought other people into our midst who desire to experience the type of free democracy that's been established in Canada and build upon it.
Okay, Father Raymond, you wanted in.
Well, just on the flag issue, on my parish on Wolfe Island, I fly the Vatican flag, the Canadian flag, current one, and the Red Ensign on things like Victoria Day and so forth to bring forth our full tradition. And the Union Jack, of course, is the marriage of the cross of St. George and the cross of St. Andrew. So these religious symbols are all around us. The point I think you raised, Steve, is correct, is that there is a bit of an anti-Christian element to that, in that while at the same time we're trying to accommodate other faiths, and no one complains about that, it is removing what is a Christian prayer historically. And there is a bit of an anti-religious dimension to that when I said earlier, you're selecting the religious traditions to be revisited. And even though we're having a very jovial and pleasant time here, my friend Rob has twice mentioned genocide, Nazis. These are the kinds of things that anti-religious people bring up when you're discussing something as tranquil as the Lord's Prayer in Queen's Park. So it does give a certain sense that there's an animus behind this, which is not merely about embracing a new Ontario.
Are you feeling a bit like Christianity is under siege with this
I wouldn't say under siege, but it's interesting that this is the one that's chosen, right? As a matter of fact, when in other ways there's an effort to incorporate and include. You can reach out, if that's the proper term, by adding the religious expression of minority groups. I don't think you build religious harmony between different groups, majority and minority, by asking one group, the majority in this case, to subtract, to become less of who they are.
Reverend Lee.
Newfoundland is one of those provinces that has decided to not have the prayer at the beginning of their sessions. And I had the privilege to be living in Newfoundland when much of this discussion was going on. I also was part of the community of Newfoundland when they have 7 separate school systems. When they decided that they were going to move to a single public school system, there was talk of Armageddon. It didn't develop that way. They have a stronger, better school system. They took religion out of the schools and made a better school system. They have the probably healthiest religious underpinning in the private, in homes and in their churches in Newfoundland, much healthier than some of the congregations I have seen in other parts of Canada, be they United Church or Catholic or other.
Roberto.
In answer to your question about the menorah, and it should be a creche, not a Christmas tree, outside the legislature on Queen's Park is one matter. Inside the legislature, as is suggested by the prayer, I think is a completely other matter. And I think it's the majority, it's precisely the majority that has to be big not only in number, but big in spirit, to really create this tent. We like to talk about a tent, Ontario and Canada as a tent, to make sure that everybody is welcome and well integrated.
Hang on, let me understand this. Hang on, forgive me, Father Raymond, let me understand this. If they have a 20-foot high menorah on the south lawn of the legislature,
well, aesthetically,
you're okay with that. But if they put it inside the building, I guess it wouldn't fit. But let's humor me with this. That would not be okay?
Yeah, I think outside it's fine. There's no reason we drive through areas to see Christmas lights as a symbol once a year. Ideally, we'd be able to visit various symbols of other people's religions throughout the year.
That's a horrible principle. The principle is that what we must protect the legislature from is religion. Everything else, you can bring any other prejudice you want in there, but we
should be multi-sectarian, or non-sectarian at the worst.
Out. And of course, as Reverend Lee said, there was an Armageddon. There was cooperation and fraternity in Newfoundland. The talk of Armageddon, my point was, the talk of religious violence always comes from the atheists. They're the ones who raise this every time we discuss
stand by.
religion in the
We're down
public
to
square.
our last 5 minutes here, and I do want to, because this was such a big story in the rest of the country, particularly in Quebec this past week, I do want to play this clip of Premier Charest from Quebec, because of course they did have their report on reasonable accommodation come back earlier this week. It recommended getting rid of, what did you call it? The decoration? The crucifix?
Yes.
The crucifix that has been in the National Assembly since, well, since the beginning, in the hopes that by removing it, it would be, Quebec would be seen as more tolerant to newcomers. Premier Charest said right away, forget about it, let's go.
The crucifix is about 350 years of history in Quebec that none of us are ever going to erase, and of a very strong presence, in particular of the Catholic Church. And that's our reality. And those who come to Quebec are joining a society where that history is now something that is part of our story.
Rob Buckman, if we in Ontario appear to be prepared to compromise, if that's the right word, I'm not sure, on the Lord's Prayer, does that suggest that we are more culturally self-confident than Quebecers who insist on keeping that tangible tie to their founding culture?
Yes. It does. And just very seriously, not nastily, this is not anti-Christianity, it's not anti-prayer, it's not even anti-God, it's anti-prayer in the legislature. In other words, it is an attempt to prove that we are big-spirited by separating matters of faith and belief from matters of behavior. That's all.
Raheel.
I just want to mention that, this question is something that I want to throw out. How is undermining the traditions, again, of the majority going to make the minority feel any better? I've never been able to understand that. And the other thing I'm not able to understand is that symbols have very little to do with how people feel. It's the symbols of our minds that we have to explore. It's what's in our mind, the kinds of racism that people have, because they don't have that opportunity to interact with each other. If all the symbols are going to be hidden, then we'll never have that communication. How are people going to learn about the majority? One of the things that we want to do as minority faiths and as minority Canadians is to learn about the mainstream as well. So you take out the Lord's Prayer, then you take out the religious symbols. Next, are you going to remove the steeples on the churches? Are you going to stop churches being built? I mean, where does this end?
Father Raymond, do you want to speak to that premise I suggested?
I would say that on the crucifix issue, very interestingly, in December '06, so 18 months ago, André Boisclair, the then Parti Québécois leader, wanted to remove the crucifix. Yesterday or last week, the whole unanimous assembly voted in favor of keeping it. The point is after all this effort to examine the accommodation of minorities, the Commission, which was very sensible in many things, made a mistake. They said the way to accommodate minorities is to subtract from the majority. And Quebec rejected that out of hand quickly, because if you were to present the path to accommodating religious minorities is to become less of who we are and to allow more space for the other, that's not going to be that's not going to work towards harmonious relations.
It's got to be addition, not subtraction.
Addition of minority faiths to the existing traditions that are there.
Don, come on in.
I've heard what Rob had to say there again, and I have a great concern whenever a secular humanist chimes in and says, faith is fine to believe, but not to express. And faith, which Rob has as well, his faith may be in the chair that he's sitting on instead of in God above, but it's something that's to be practiced and expressed. Otherwise, people of faith are constrained from being engaged in the public square.
Okay, with 1 minute to go, let me give a last word to you, Roberto Martello. What do you want to do?
Why I think symbols are very, very important is do thoughts give rise to words, or do words give rise to thought? And in Quebec, I would say, without sounding blasphemous that the crucifix has become a pop culture icon. Much the Quebec has a strong sense of self that we don't have in Ontario. Les Boys, in the supermarkets you buy the magazines,
the fanzines. More secular now too.
More secular, and so I would dare say that the crucifix is a pop culture icon, and that's perhaps why it will stay more than its religious symbolism.
Okay, my hunch is that the six of you have quite accurately reflected the splits that are going on across this province right now. I want to thank all of you for a great discussion, starting with Don Hutchison okay, Michael, you want me to do this first? Okay, Father Raymond D'Souza, Raheel Raza, and Dr. Rob Buckman on this side of the table. On the other side of the table, we've got Reverend Lee Simpson and Roberto Martella, excuse me, and Don Hutchison in Ottawa. Thanks for being there on the line from the nation's capital.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, everyone.